Bro, it is so fucking freezing this morning.
I know, it got down to about 1 last night here. And I know out in the valley it was like -2, so I can't imagine how cold it would be out west.
For everyone who doesn't know, that is quite cold for Melbourne weather.
Well, we went from like the warmest like kind of period on like calendar, like, you know, we'd had an unseasonably warm month, and then suddenly it's just gone straight down to like, it got up to like 12 the other day or 14 or something. I tell you what though, like playing football last night, it was fucking perfect. I felt so good. Like, it was cold. It was like 14 degrees and a bit windy, and the sun was out, and I was like, oh, this is crap. And then as the sun went down and the lights came on, I felt so much better. I need that cold kind of weather to feel active. So yeah, no, I was enjoying it.
Not too cold, right? You're
Yeah.
getting a bit long in the tooth now to be playing football so much, Kieran. Cold weather equals hamstrings. You know that.
I was very kind of concerned about that, but I actually felt better as it went on. So I've been, you know, careful with the way
This
I'm
week.
playing at the moment. This week's been good. Yeah.
Lucky I've got my cup of tea to keep my hands warm because my fingers are going numb. And can I
Yeah.
just say, I think maybe the best cup of tea might be peppermint herbal tea. That's probably going to piss off everyone in the UK, but stiff shit.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I think I like a bit of an
Yeah.
Earl Grey personally, but yeah, all good. All
Ooh,
good.
fancy.
And a hot cup of tea is essential, especially when I'm out in the shed painting in this weather, and it's taken the paint like 10 minutes to dry because it's just so cold.
The problem is the tea goes cold too quickly. I like to nurse it.
It's hard to nurse and paint at the same time.
Yes, this is true. The best thing is just to bosh it down with one swig, just like you.
So, what are we talking about today, bro?
All right, episode 4, Heresy on the Drive Home.
Power fist.
A topic that we feel strongly about, I think, but also have some differing opinions on, is scaling and scale in heresy. So leads us to our sort of first question here. What is heresy scale? What do you define as heresy scale?
Well, yeah, that's a tough one because there's when I think of like heresy scale as a whole, I'm thinking slightly smaller because my automatic comparison is with 40k and like the Primaris and everything getting bigger and bigger. But like within that heresy scale, there is such a broad kind of area. Like we have our first edition models, resin models, that are tiny and spindly, and then we had our, you know, first plastic kits from the Calth box and then the Prospero box with the Mark III, Mark IV, Tartarus and Cataphracti, and they were larger than the resin in general, but they were definitely much chunkier than the resin. And then, of course, in second edition, we got a new scale of models, and everyone was going on about how they're a larger scale of models, the Mark VI. But when I look at them, they don't look that much bigger to me, really. All that they are is, you know, they have generally kind of more kind of upright poses, and they're a little bit skinnier even in some parts than the plastic Mark III and Mark IV, which makes them look taller and larger, even though, you know, they're not actually that much bigger. So I think all of those kind of scales, especially the plastic kits from first edition and the plastic kits from second edition, actually fit together quite well height wise. It's more in their, you know, the proportions of the models that is a bit different. And, you know, the best example of that is with the new plastic kits, that the heads are so tiny, right? And that kind of also makes the models look a lot larger than they really are. So, you know, we all got very excited for a larger scale of model, but they're not really that much larger. Like, as far as their you know, physical height is concerned, they just look larger because of the proportions on the models. So heresy scale is just such a broad topic that I think we'll have a great conversation about it today, but there are just so many options for it. How do you feel about it? Do you see that kind of breadth and variety in the setting, or?
It's it's almost like Heresy Scale is fluid. There's no
Yeah.
set in concrete, this is exactly what it is.
Yeah.
I've got a sneaking suspicion that Games Workshop doesn't really know what it is, or it's not really a, you know, a description or a height chart, for example.
Yeah.
We can look at things like the new plastic tacticals in the Mark 6, and like you've said, there's no real, or there's only very, very minor height variation to them, but it's the other components that move out of that old heroic scale
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
starting to transition into something that's more in proportion. Because if we look back at models from 20 years ago in that heroic scale, they do have exaggerated hands, exaggerated heads, and that
Big
sort of
hands,
stuff.
big feet. Yeah. Yeah.
It is a design language and a style in itself, but it helps obviously paint the miniatures, and it gives them um, an easily identifiable appearance from that 2 foot away on the tabletop sort of
Yeah.
thing, right? So we've kind of moved out of the heroic scale age in a way into this new sort of scaling that is better proportioned. So like you
Yeah.
said, things that affect this are the size of the head. The head's gotten smaller. The hands have gotten considerably smaller. And
Yeah.
proportion is relative to the sculpt that it's on. And scale across Heresy is not only limited to the Marines, but we're also talking about things like Terminators that are suffering a little bit now from the change in
For
proportions
sure.
and
Yeah.
scaling. And we can also look at things like the the old box dreadnought compared to the size of a, you know, Contemptor compared to the size of the Leviathan, and now we're talking
Yeah.
about this new Saturnine dread as well, right?
Yeah.
So there's a degree of fluidity
Mm.
in the scale. Um, I think what's really important to caveat with this discussion is maybe like, what are the things we look for when identifying what the correct scale is?
Yeah. And I
So
think,
what I mean by that, I mean, everyone's going to have a differing opinion on what the correct scale is, because at the end of the day, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, always,
yeah.
right? But there are some things that you can identify within Heresy models, plastics, old resins, 3D printed parts, and parts from third parties that you need to sort of consider, especially when you're looking at merging these kits, or running with multiple variations of these kits within the army. Things that you probably need to consider before you just go ahead and do it. Because, I mean, you've probably seen countless examples as well of people putting together conversions and parts, and something just does not look quite right with the end result. And a lot of the
Yeah.
time that does have a lot to do with scaling and choosing the right parts for any given conversion.
Yeah.
So what sort of things do you really look for when it comes to correct scale, or identifying your preferred scale?
Yeah. So what you said just before about scaling and proportions, I think in that kind of conversation, for me personally, proportions are far more important than scaling. So when I'm looking to put pieces together, I'm looking to see how they fit together on the model. I'm not, as concerned necessarily about how like tall the model is, for example, the scale. So, you know, my personal taste for, you know, these kind of scales is I generally like a Space Marine that is larger, that looks larger because the head is smaller. So I do like those smaller heads, but I also like larger bodies. So it's about trying to get that balance right. um, and that can be a bit of a challenge, especially with the older kits, and that's why like I personally have gone and used some third party models that I thought better suited how I imagined the scale, how I've imagined it in my head based on artwork and what I've seen. So yeah, you've just brought up this image here of some of my Emperor's children over the years. On the left there, the first guy along, we've got an old Mark IV. That was like the first Mark IV that came out of Forge World. Obviously, I've done a little bit of conversion work on there to make him look more like an Emperor's child, but you can see how small and dinky he is, how tiny, skinny little legs, massive head. The power pack's still the same scale as it's always been, so it looks huge.
Yeah.
Then we move on to this, the second edition plastic Mark 6. You can see he's not that much taller than the other Marine, but he looks a lot larger because his head is a lot smaller, his hands are smaller, like you said. He's just far more better proportioned,
Mm.
and that's what I was going for when I used the Tortuga guy who's third in the line there. I'd started working on them before we got the improved proportions in the new plastic kits. So I was looking to create those proportions myself through a combination of Games Workshop plastic models and third-party models. So, again, the body is much larger, but I've used one of the old heads, which is also larger. And it's just that combination of the much larger and chunkier body with an old head that makes the old head look small. So I've created something that maybe is a little bit closer to the newer kits in proportion.
Yeah.
It is noticeably chunkier, obviously, but just how the head
Yeah.
kind of proportions with the body. And for me personally, the head is generally the most important part of the model.
Mm.
And then the last guy in the line there is just one of the new plastic Emperor's children with an old Palatine blade head. And again, I think the proportions are really good on the new Chaos Space Marine kits in general. I don't really like how they've made the legs a bit skinnier on the Emperor's children, for example. But as far as proportions are concerned, I'm very happy with them. So yeah, it's just for me personally, as I've said before, it's more about proportions rather than scale. And I'm not sure if I'm correctly kind of identifying the difference between those two terms, but the way I think about it in my head is like the scale is like how tall the model is next to a ruler, and the proportions are like how the different parts of the model kind of fit together. So yeah, that's always been
Proportion's
more important for
relative,
me.
right?
Yeah.
Proportion is relative to the model that you are sort of building at any given time. And then that model relates to the rest of your force as well, right? So you do want to have some continuity throughout your army.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I really like, two main things I try and identify with scale first.
Yeah.
Because it is a broad term, right? You mentioned the height before.
Yep.
So I look at height. The ways that I identify whether the height is matching or not matching is I generally go off the height of where the hips sit in terms of the height of the legs. And then also I look at, and probably more importantly, I look at where the collar or the gorget finishes in height, because that will determine the height of my head, right? Because roughly all Marines will have similar sort of head, right? You mentioned that the newer kits, they have smaller sorts of heads. Sometimes they suffer a little bit from being set too far into the neck. So I'll put like a tiny little green stuff spacer or something in there to make the head and the neck have more movement and give it more dynamics. But it's really that gorget line or the collar line, whether it's the front of the collar or the back of the collar where the power pack sits, that really determines my overall height when I'm looking at Marines. And then the second main component of that is like the girth and the thickness.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get the word girth in there. But it's true.
It is, yeah. It is.
Because relatively speaking, right, it impacts the volume of the miniature, right? And it's the volume that gives the miniature presence and weight and gravitas, right?
Yeah.
And that's the things that you want to sort of match in your army. So do you have any other examples that you may want to show, Kieran?
Yeah, and I know that it's a common kind of criticism of Tortuga that they can be a bit thick and a bit girthy, but personally, that's how I like my Marines. I like my Marines thick because I don't know, it just kind of matches more closely the artwork from back in the day that I really enjoyed with heavier legs, smaller heads, that kind of thing. This image showing right now, it's for people listening at home, it's a lineup of my Alpha Legion Imperial Fist Army, and it's got on the left there's a new Indomitus model. It's from one of the Dark Angels kits, a Tortuga Tartarus model, armless Dynat, who's at his regular scale, and then we've got one of the new Mark 6 Marines, and it's just showing like a different kind of scale of Marines across the force. And I think this is where Adam and I are going to be a bit different on our perspectives of scaling and proportions, because I'm comfortable with having different scales within the same force. Generally, I'll try and keep the scale set to a unit, so I won't have different models of different scales within the same unit. But I don't mind that, for example, this Recon Marine with his Nemesis Bolter is quite a lot smaller than the Terminator, well, both the Terminators. And Dynat is slightly larger or kind of very similar in scale, but he's a character model, so again, I'm not too fussed about that. As long as it's consistent within units, I'm less concerned about consistency across the force, as long as I'm happy with the proportions of each of the models. So I do like bigger, taller Terminators, so I can use those. I've used that old Mark IV bear head that I use on every single model. It's a bit of a meme at this stage, and
You reckon?
yeah, it would look ridiculous these days on like the old plastics from first edition, just because of the proportions. But on the newer, larger models, it looks perfect. It fits nicely the way the smaller heads fit on the kind of slimmer scale of the new Mark 6 and Mark 3. So that's me personally, I'm less concerned about force-wide consistency the way I know you are. You're particular in trying to get everything to match up really nicely. Whereas, in my Emperor's Children, for example, all of the infantry and characters and everything are all in that Tortuga scale, so quite a bit larger. But, my jet bike riders and my javelin crew are in the classic Resin Mark IV, which is tiny compared to the Tortuga.
Yeah.
Like, very small, very skinny. But I'm less concerned about that because the fact that they're on jet bikes or in javelins means that they're never going to be seen standing side by side with my infantry. So that kind of direct comparison is a lot harder to make, and it's not going to look, as unnatural as if I had like, a Tortuga squad standing right next to a much smaller Mark IV support squad or something. So, there are different ways you can include these units in your army and not have it look completely ridiculous. And I'm quite comfortable with that. There's always been like a bit of a scale issue within Warhammer, in general, not just in 40 and 30k. Like there's no way like you're going to fit 10 Space Marines in a Rhino, right? Or 5 Terminators in a Land Raider.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we've always got those slight kind of scaling issues, and I'm a bit looser about that. But I know that you like to put a lot more effort into getting everything just right.
Well, I think it's just a little bit of an OCD bugbear that I've got. I think that if I know that I can influence something to make it better, I probably will end up doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at some point, right, you have to accept some sort of concession along the way. And it's good that you bring up the Javelin, for example, because the Javelin crew is tiny.
Yeah.
I mean, you only really see the top half, which you can get away with.
Yeah.
And it's probably lucky that you could get away with them.
Yeah.
But if you're talking maybe old Mark IV jet bike riders, for example,
Yeah.
did you say you use them in your army?
I do, and I'm comfortable with them. But I know that that would probably be a little bit too far for you. I think probably.
Maybe, but I'm
Yeah.
just maybe I'm being way too anal. I don't know. For me personally, it just doesn't.
Yeah.
I know I could make it better, so I probably will.
Yeah.
But it comes with blood, sweat, and tears,
Yeah.
and it's why I'm not as productive when it comes to finishing models, because I'm
Yeah.
stuck in the weeds on a lot of these issues and trying to work through them. One of the issues I faced when I was starting my Salamanders army was, or how can I future-proof these Terminators and Fire Drakes and stuff that I want to include in my list that isn't going to be made redundant 2 or 3 years from now, when eventually new Cataphracti and new Tartarus kits are released in a larger scale, like we've seen with the Indomitus Terminators.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a huge hurdle for me to try and problem solve in the really early stages of planning this project. What I ended up coming up with was almost like an eclectic in-between mishmash of parts and conversion work in order to have things sort of sit right with me. So I ended up finding some legs I could suitably scale and print to the size that I wanted. Now, this came with a lot of trial and error as well. I printed 5 different sets of legs in 5 different scales. And then it wasn't until I started really looking at the pieces up close that I knew which size I wanted to work with going forward.
Yeah.
I really liked the size and the detailing of the Justeran kits in their torsos. And I knew that because they got the larger socket for the head, it would work with the heads that I wanted in there. So using a standard Forge World torso was also a must. And I also had some Tortuga Cataphractis that you'd passed over to me to experiment with for this project. And when I really started to build them, I was kind of turned off because the volume was too much. And what I mean was volume is length times width times height. There was just way too much Terminator in there. It makes the standard Games Workshop heads, look a little bit dinky and small to me personally.
See, I love that. I reckon he looks fucking perfect there. So that's just our different
my
tastes.
my head canon for Terminators though, and I think this harkens back to old chapter approved articles. Remember when chapter approved was in White Dwarf? So this is going back to like third edition 40k. A Marine was described as being 8 foot tall, and a Terminator was described as being 9 foot tall. But if you compare this Tortuga Terminator or Cataphractic Terminator, because there are height changes in the Tortuga range as well, which we can kind of get into if you want to. But if you compare the Tortuga Terminator, which is left of screen right now, to the standard Mark 6 plastics, which is the scale that I wanted to match for my Marines as close as possible, the Terminator almost looks like a full third taller than the Marine, which breaks my head canon, because I don't believe the Terminator should be that much bigger than what a Marine is. He should be bigger. He should be bulkier. And that's what I wanted out of my own Terminator. So what I found with this Terminator was a middle ground that I was really comfortable with. Additional changes I had to make was, well, how was I going to get more like broadness out of the Terminator? Because the Games Workshop torsos are a little bit smaller. I need to make the Terminator broader. So what that also meant was offsetting the arms from the torso a little bit more and filling in that soft armor join with green stuff as well, because I needed more shoulder breadth across the top in order to create that bigger volume. And I went just with standard Justeran arms because I felt that they were long enough. We can talk about arms coming up too, because arms are a bit of a contentious issue for me when we talk about third parties and printing and that sort of stuff. So I felt that the Just Aaron arms were perfect as well, so I went with them. But I ended up working in these little tricks to make a Terminator size that I was happy with. Now, I got my little measuring stick out and my ruler, and what I had as an end result, I don't know, it's a little bit hard to see this yellow line that I've made on this model here, but essentially where I measure to is from the bottom of the foot where it attaches to the base to the very top of the, I don't know what you'd call that, the cowl of the Terminator armor. On the top, and I think I'm sitting here at 43 mil, top to bottom, right? Which is within like 0.5 of a Tortuga Terminator. But what it doesn't have is that huge volume that for me doesn't sit right proportionally.
Okay.
But for you, it does, right? And this is where we kind of differ. So now I've kind of created a model that won't look out of place against an army like yours if we were to have a game, right? Because the Terminators will be equally sort of imposing in size. However, I feel like they match the rest of my army more. So it was definitely a really delicate sort of situation and problem-solving thing that took me a little while to work through, and there was lots of trials and error involved. This end result certainly wasn't my first attempt. It took a lot of experimentation and massaging to sort of get it to where I was comfortable with. And now that, I have at sort of, set scale, I can then apply it to the other Terminators in my army, and everything is that sort of consistent height now. But I know you do like the Tortuga sort of way of doing things. So do you maybe want to shed just a little bit more light on Tortuga, maybe any other third parties that you know of? Or maybe how their sort of scaling does compare to the rest. I know you've got a really great comparison picture here of the Terminators.
Yeah, I do definitely prefer the Tortuga scale to compared to the first edition plastics that we got from Games Workshop. I think the new edition stuff, the Mark 6 and Mark 3, although I would like larger models, I think the proportions are quite good. I think like if I had a printer and I knew what I was doing, I'd be printing my own models as well rather than using Tortuga all the time. It's just that I feel like Tortuga has a better models and better proportions than the models that are available to me without a 3D printer. So I probably would change things a little bit, make them maybe not quite as chunky and that kind of thing. But considering that I don't have access to a printer, it's better than what is otherwise available to me. So that's why I go for it. Yeah.
I think there's also two important other factors when you talk about Tortuga.
Yeah.
There is a wide range of stuff in stock that you could buy. And working with that Tortuga casted resin is a lot easier to work with and convert than 3D printed resin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think
it's the easy alternative to like 3D printing, right? Like with a 3D printer, you can be far more specific and get exactly what you want. But as I don't have one and I don't have access to one, it means that the Tortuga stuff is just far easier to convert, easier to get hold of, and just is a really great alternative that I enjoy using compared to
some of the stuff they got looks mint.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Some less than others, but in general, I really enjoy what they do. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to touch on printing as well before we finish.
Yeah.
When we talk about printing and scale, the scale is determined by the sculptor. It's not a fixed. It's an arbitrary number at the end of the day. It's not a fixed rule that governs all 3D sculpting. So that is really important to know. one sculptor's version of 100% true scale, or whatever they want to call it, I guarantee you, probably won't match up to the next sculptor's idea of 100% true scale. And this is where we touched on before, is that it is completely subjective, and it is up to the eye of the beholder. But when it comes to printing these at home, or buying from a 3D printing service or whatever, it's a huge consideration that maybe goes over a lot of people's heads, because a lot of the time something could be advertised as being true scale, or being heresy scale, or being new heresy scale, and they all mean
What does that
completely
mean?
different things, right? So if you were to put them all on the one model, it could look completely out of place. And one of the big things or common things that I've noticed is that there's a lot of 3D printed arms and stuff, especially.
I was going to ask about the arms, because you mentioned them earlier,
and weapons, right? And a lot of the time,
they're too big, right?
The arms come out and they're too big.
Yeah, they're always too big.
They're too big and they're too long. And what you end up with is a Marine that ends up looking like a bit like a gorilla or something, where his knuckles are dragging along the ground. Or his hands are down by his kneecaps. And that's just not in proportion at all to any sort of humanoid.
That's going back to the old first edition kind of proportions, And it's very different to how I like my Marines, with longer legs and kind of shorter arms, just to kind of make them look taller. It's very different.
So if we're looking biomechanically at proportion, you've got your head height, right? That's been set. We've touched on that already. When you look at arms, right, and you can do this in the mirror at home, and I guarantee you, everyone will be the same, right? When you have your relaxed arms down by your side, they finish just past your hips, about halfway down your thigh, right? And that's what I aim for in my models too. So the wrists of my Marines, right, generally finish just after the hips, because naturally that's how they look best, because that's how humans are built. So that's what I always consider to look for as well. And then you need to consider the thickness of these, 3D printed parts and arms and stuff as well, because arms aren't as thick as your legs unless you skip leg day every day and just focus on upper body. Right? They're just not. The muscles and the armature of a human body is just not like that. So they should be more slender. They should be the correct thickness, or what looks correct, and they should hang at the body at the correct height as well. So that's a huge consideration. Are there any other sort of like red flags that you can think when you think about scale and 3D sort of printed scaling?
No, well, as soon as you mentioned arms, I knew that you were going to say that they're too large, because I absolutely agree. There are a lot that are far too large, and I suppose that's the advantage of having your own printer, right? Like you said, you've made like 5 different sets of those legs to try and get the right scale, but if you're buying from like someone selling 3D parts, it can be pretty difficult to tell how they're going to look on your model before you get them, as far as like scale and proportions concerned.
That was a huge issue I had when I was buying from people like printers locally. I'd order these things and put in a bulk order for parts, and I had my plan ready to go, and they'd come delivered to my house, and I was just underwhelmed because they weren't the right size. And it felt like a waste of money, because I just couldn't really use them. So definitely, if you are printing at home as well, tips would be to print at a handful of print the same part at a handful of different sizes. I know it's a waste of resin and resources and stuff like that, but it does pay dividends in the end.
Get it right.
Record in a notebook what you're scaling different parts at, for different sculptors. I
Yeah.
print not just from one different sculptor. I print from a multitude of different sources, and
Yeah.
everyone's different. So that trial and error always comes into play until you have got your recipe down.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, like there's a lot of kind of personal preference in people's sculpts as well. Some people are copying directly from some kind of material, but other people who are doing creative kind of work, like Cornell, one of my favorite 3D sculptors, his personal taste in models is similar to mine in that he likes the smaller heads, but he takes
Yep.
it even further and makes them absolutely tiny without making the models necessarily larger. And that can be
Yep.
difficult to paint, and it might not kind of suit your own kind of perspective. Whereas, like, I feel like I like the proportions on his models, so I would happily use his models, but I might do them at like a larger, like 100 and whatever, 105 or
Yep.
103% or something, just to scale them up a little bit to bring the heads more in line with the new sculpts.
Yep.
But yeah, it's trial and error, like you said. Is it completely random, or do you generally find that like 98% or 97% is kind of where do you usually kind of start to try and hit when you're looking for a ballpark, or is it just completely different?
It's random.
It's random, yeah.
It is. It's
Yeah.
It's completely random. I mean, to some people, 1% is unnoticeable.
Yeah.
But when you compare them side by side,
Yeah.
it is noticeable for the discerning eye, and
Yeah.
it does make a difference to your overall look. So
Yeah.
it is a challenge. It's probably always going to be a challenge because there's no set rule and it isn't set in stone. Games
Yeah.
Workshop are probably going to keep the fluidity of scale
Yeah.
going for the foreseeable future as well. So
And
hopefully this conversation has maybe made you a little
yeah.
bit more discerning, or you've been able to identify what your particular taste might be on scale and go
Yeah.
from there.
And I was just thinking, like, if you're printing out a completely 3D model, I can imagine that'd be much more difficult to get the proportions right rather than printing off like parts to use on an existing model where you can directly compare how they scale and how the proportions work with, you know, for example, like printing off a head or shoulder plates or arms to use on an existing Games Workshop plastic. I imagine that's much easier and more straightforward than for a
Yeah,
full 3D kind of sculpt.
yeah, it is. It is. However, I also like to experiment with the full sculpt as well, and try
Yeah,
and have that match that Games Workshop profile of
yeah,
scale, because then I know when I hit print the next time, it's all going to be usable and it's all going to be interchangeable, whether it's resin
yeah,
plastic or whether it's resin printed or Games Workshop plastic, it's all going to be interchangeable, and I know it's all going to work.
yeah.
So
So do you sometimes need to kind of chop up the model and do different parts at different scales? Like you might do the torso and the legs at 98, and you might do the
yeah,
9 arms at 90, like 5 or something like
yeah,
that. Just
yeah. It
just
just
whatever
depends on
works.
who the sculptor is, what the part is, and how that fits proportion wise relative to the models that I'm making. So it's all encompassing of everything that we've just spoken about.
Yeah. Well, that's just kind of highlights the importance these days, I suppose, of having a printer at home if that's the kind of thing that is important to you, having the right proportions and scales. Just
Yeah, I
getting things
guess,
to
or
match and mix. If you don't want to just completely limit yourself to a set number of kits, because if you wanted that kind of new scale at this stage and just using Games Workshop kits, you wouldn't have any Terminators, would you? Like
yeah,
you know, just the
yeah, or
basic
I'd still be
infantry.
pulling my hair out, or I'd have a result that I'm only 90% happy with and not 100%
Yeah,
happy with. And to
yeah,
me, that's not good enough.
yeah,
But that's just me maybe being a little bit hard on myself. I don't know.
yeah.
Anyway,
Well, yeah,
I hope that's brought a good bit of discussion for everyone, and it's a little bit of meat to chew. Anything else to add before we close it out?
No, not really. Just looking forward to seeing what that kind of that new Saturnine scale looks like, and if we just get another, a further different kind of scale and proportion to add to the whole Heresy set that is Heresy scaling. And from what we've seen in the photos, they look incredibly massive. So we'll have to wait and see how that all works. Really, yeah.
Yeah. All right, everyone. You know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe. Hit us up with your thoughts.
Yeah, let us
And
know what you
we'll
think
see
about
you
scaling.
in the
Yeah.
next one.
See you later.
Hardcore Heresy.